Your outline, we are looking at the periods, as Levi mentioned, the periods of biblical history, and I put the 11 periods on the outline, and we'll take just a minute to just kind of briefly go through those, and then what we'll seek to do is then kind of get in to those periods. And as we talked about last time that we met together, we'll probably try to get through at least 2, maybe 3 of those biblical periods in this first session of class. If we get that far, if we don't, Levi's indicated that's fine as well. We want to kind of just dig down a little bit deeper than just glossing over, even though that would be a beneficial study as well. And as I mentioned, those 11 periods of biblical history, some might break the Bible down into 13 periods. Some may break it down into 15 or 16 periods. And so this is not something that has to be in stone. This is just a way that I approached it from some material that I studied many years ago from Brother Wayne Jackson, as I made mention of, and he broke it down in those 11 periods. And then I just went back and started adding things to those periods. But of course, that first period is obviously what you might know of as the period of beginnings. And it kind of just basically tells you what the period is dealing with. It's dealing with beginnings. And Levi made mention just a little bit ago about Genesis 1, and I have in our notes there the unique aspect of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 to the rest of the Bible, and there's some reasoning behind that, of course, but obviously the beginning of the universe, and God speaks this universe into existence ex nihilo. He takes nothing, or there is nothing, and then He miraculously creates what we have and what we see in this world today. But as you move along in relationship to that, we also then see that this period covers the first 11 chapters. And we'll talk in just a little bit more about about the first period of biblical history. But Genesis chapter 1 and through 11 covers then the period of beginnings. Then, of course, in Genesis chapter 12 down to Genesis chapter 50 is what we will call the Hebrew family. And, of course, the Hebrew family basically focuses on 4 earthly individuals. The 5th individual, of course, being God. And God is the focus, of course, and Jesus Christ is the focus, of course, throughout the Scriptures. Now, let me say again something I said last time. As we approach this study, keep it in your mind, and we're going to approach it from the standpoint of one book with 66 different chapters, and one thread that runs through this one book and ties every book or chapter together. And they're all intertwined and interconnected. And even in a chapter or a book in which God Himself is not mentioned, we know God is all in that book. Well, as we study that, keep that in mind as we move along. Now, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, of course, are those 4 primary individuals. Others are dealt with, spoken of, and we will talk about others. But from Genesis 12 down to Genesis chapter 50, the focus then is on those 4 main individuals. And then the third period is the period of Egyptian bondage. Now, Exodus chapter 1, and it gets a little bit, and can get a little bit differentiated as to how you might want to separate this, but Exodus chapter 1 down to Exodus chapter 14 deals with the period of Egyptian bondage. Now, as we reflect back on the Hebrew family, of course, the call of Abraham and the promise that God made to Abraham then would run through Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And as you get then to Exodus chapter 1, if you'll remember in about verse 8, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not God. Well, you see then that period of Egyptian bondage then that comes into play. And then the fourth period from Exodus chapter 15 down to Deuteronomy chapter 34 is the period of the wilderness wanderings. Now, if you remember, and I know that you do, Exodus, of course, dealing with the Exodus, coming out of Egyptian bondage. Leviticus, of course, deals with all the worship laws and other laws that God gave. And, of course, in Exodus chapter 20, the giving of the law of Moses. And then you have the book of Numbers, and the book of Numbers focuses on God's people and their wandering in the wilderness and up and down that Sinai Peninsula for those 40 years in that 40-year period. And then you have, of course, the book of Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy just means second law. Well, it wasn't that God was giving a second new law. God was rehearsing the law that He gave in Exodus chapter 20. And why did God need to do that? What? All right. What was going to happen to the first generation? They would die in the wilderness, and it would be the second generation then that would be the generation that would enter into the land of Canaan. So there's a rehearsal then of the law that God gave in Exodus chapter 20, and Deuteronomy just means second law, but it's second in the sense that it's just a rehearsal of the law that was given earlier on. Then you look at the settlement of Canaan is the next period. Joshua chapter 1 down to 1 Samuel chapter 7. Now, of course, God's people being led now by Joshua, because Moses would no longer be the leader, and Moses would not enter into the land of Canaan, but Joshua would be the leader now. And Joshua would lead God's people, and of course, they would conquer 3 cities or regions there on the east of the Jordan, and then they would cross over, and they would first then conquer a strip in the middle part of the land of Canaan, and then they would move southward and then northward, and they would conquer those territories during that period of time. But one of the major problems that existed and would continue to exist and haunt them was the fact that they continued to allow certain pockets of resistance, and they didn't do what God told them to do. And because those pockets of resistance were allowed to remain, they continued to be a thorn in the side of God's people for a long period of time. Well, Joshua then, leading God's people into the land of Canaan, well, you get down to 1 Samuel chapter 7, and that leads us then into the next period of biblical history, which is the United Kingdom. Now, what happens, of course, in 1 Kings chapter 8? What do they want? They want a king, but who was their king? God. God was their king, but they wanted an earthly king to be like all the nations round about them. And so God allows them to have a king, and of course, because of the poor decision that they made in not allowing God to be the king and central, well, problems arose from that. And the first, of course, king was Saul, and he served for 40 years. And then along came David, and he served for 40 years. And then along came Solomon, and he served for 40 years. So the United Kingdom then lasted for a period of about 120 years. Now, you get down then to 1 Kings, and this United Kingdom would go from 1 Samuel 8 to 2 Kings chapter 11. Because what then would happen in 2 Kings chapter 12? The division of the nation. You had the problem that arose because of Jeroboam, and you had then the division of the United Kingdom, and you would now have 10 tribes that would be part of the northern kingdom, and the capital there would be Samaria. Judah and Benjamin would still be in the south, and Jerusalem would remain the capital there. But then you had each of these kingdoms who would have multiple kings. And I always get this mixed up. Which had the 20? Was it the north or the south? I always get them mixed up. North had 20 kings and the south had 19?
That's right.
Is that right? I think that's right. But all the kings in the north, of all those kings, not a one was a good king. And only in the southern kingdom did you have a few good kings that came out of the southern kingdom. But you had, because of what Jeroboam did, and how would you like to have this on your tombstone? He led Israel to sin. And that was said of him probably nearly 20 times in Scripture. And that would be his epitaph that would be left as he led God's people to sin. Well, you had then that divided kingdom and all those different kings, and that would last and go through from 1 Kings 12 to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And that brings us then to the last period of the Old Testament, and that being the period of Babylonian captivity. And that Babylonian captivity would be the books that fit into that are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And I mentioned this, I think, chronologically speaking, Malachi is not the last book of the Old Testament. The last book, or that last period, would be Ezra and Nehemiah. And they're coming out of Babylonian captivity. Now, that 70-year period of captivity, what we find, and of course the next period is going to be the period of the intertestamental period or the interbiblical period where God is silent for some 400 years. But when you get to the next period and you begin to read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you read of some things that you don't read about in the Old Testament. And what we figure out and what we know from secular history is some of these things had to have their beginning during that period of biblical history. Now, scholars are somewhat divided. For example, when you get to the New Testament, you read about the synagogue. Well, you don't read about that in the Old Testament. Now, some scholars believe that the synagogue maybe arose out of Babylonian captivity and during the period of Babylonian captivity because God's people longed to worship, and yet they could not. Some were exiled, of course, from Jerusalem in Babylonian captivity, and they could not worship God. And so the synagogue got its beginning there. And what did you have to have in order, as time grew on, to have a synagogue? Had to be at least 10 male Jews to have a synagogue. Now, let me say this as well, and we'll probably try to get into this a little bit. Technically speaking, who was a Jew? Well, yes and no. You had to be the seed of Abraham to be a Jew, but Ishmael was of the seed of Abraham. But was he a Jew? Pardon? A descendant of David. Technically speaking, a Jew was someone who descended from Judah, from the tribe of Judah. And Judah and Benjamin, technically speaking, early on were the Jews. Now, when individuals returned from Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, they assimilated from the standpoint that they later became, all of those tribes became known as Israel and the nation of Israel. But I said that and I asked that question to say this. All Jews were Hebrews, but not all Hebrews were Jews. You understand what I'm saying? And all Israelites were Jews, but not all Jews were Israelites. Now, we probably kind of overlook that from the standpoint of later on, as I stated, all Jews technically became known as the people or the nation of Israel. But to begin with, what did you have? You had that divided kingdom. And you had those 10 tribes to the north, and then you had the 2 tribes to the south, and from the 2 tribes to the south, and even more technically Judah, came the Jews. Well, Brother Guyan Woods, in his question and answer books, I don't know if you've got those. If you don't have them, you need to get them. But in his 2 volumes of question and answers that he used to do the Freed-Hardeman question and answer open forum, but he has an excellent piece in there on the breakdown of the Hebrew and the Israelite and the Jew, and it's very interesting. And he also has a very good book on background study of biblical lands. It's a little paperback book, but just for your own personal interest, either one of those are excellent little background studies in relationship to that. All right, but now you have then the Babylonian captivity, and you had, of course, the return from Babylonian captivity, and that would take place somewhere around 536 BC, but it took place in 3 different waves. Zerubbabel, and then Ezra and Nehemiah, all 3 led those returns because some were allowed then to return to Jerusalem. Now, when they returned from Babylonian captivity, then the Old Testament comes to a close. And now you have, from the close of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New, that 400-year period of silence. But there's a lot that takes place during that 400-year period of silence that's very, very interesting. And if you have some knowledge of that, when you get then to the New Testament, some things make some sense. If someone didn't know anything at all about that intertestamental period, and you pick up Matthew and begin reading, you're going to read about some things that you don't read about in the Old Testament. You're going to think, well, what is this? What's going on here? And the synagogue was just one of those examples. But keep in mind, in relationship to when Jesus came to this earth, was it just a random point of time when he came to this earth? No. Galatians chapter 4 and 4, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, born under the law, that he might redeem them that are under the law. That phrase, the fullness of time, what does that mean? Well, basically it means when the time was just right. He didn't come a day earlier. He didn't come a couple of months later than he should have come. He came at exactly the right time. Now, I said that because during that interbiblical period, God is silent, but God is not inactive. And he's working providentially during that 400-year period to get everything just as he wanted it to be when Jesus came to this earth. You think about the Roman system of the roads and the expansion of travel. Well, what would that have to do with Jesus coming to this earth? All right, spread of the gospel. Travel routes were made much, much easier in relationship to some things that began to take place during that interbiblical period. And there are other things that we'll talk about once we ever get to that. But then, of course, you come out of that, and then the New Testament has two periods: the life of Christ, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then, of course, the rest of it is the establishment and expansion of Christianity, and that's from Acts all the way down to Revelation. And so that's your 11 periods of biblical history. Now, I stated that what I did many years ago was memorize those books that fit into those periods, and then go back in your own personal study and study major events that took place during those periods of biblical history. And I promise you, or you get your money back, I promise you the Bible will come alive to you in a way that it never has before. And it is the one major thing that I did years and years ago that I would recommend to anyone. And I wished that I had done it and had known to do it long before I ever did. And I thank God for Brother Wayne Jackson and that little book that I came across all those years ago, that, by the way, is still available, I think, today. And just a great little book, and then you put together other resources and things of that nature. Now, notice in your notes, I make mention of the 5 poetical books. Now, those 5 poetical books, I'm not saying that they don't have anything to do with the Old Testament. I'm just saying that the language of those books is very different, because the language is poetical language. Now, of course, the book of Psalms is the Hebrew songbook or hymnal, and a lot of those psalms deal with personal struggles that individuals had, but it also deals with struggles that the nation of Israel had and the people of God had. It's been said by more than one writer or author, there's not any emotion that any individual has ever experienced that you can't find somewhere in the book of Psalms. And Levi's probably already brought that out. It's a great devotional book for that very reason. So you had Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Job, many scholars believe, is the oldest book possibly in the Bible. And the indication seems to be that Job likely lived during the patriarchal age, because there's no mention in the book of Job of those sacrifices offered under the law of Moses. And he was a priest in the sense that he was a father of his family, and he offered sacrifices on behalf of his family, which would seem to indicate then the father rule aspect of that. And thus Job very likely may have been written, maybe in that, or early enough being maybe the oldest book, but pertaining to events that happened during the patriarchal age, more than likely. Well, then you look at the major prophets and the minor prophets. And all of those books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, the major prophets, and then Hosea all the way into Malachi, they're going to be dealing with the periods of captivity. Assyrian captivity, Babylonian captivity, and the northern kingdom went into captivity around 721 BC. And you would think that the southern kingdom would have learned some lessons, but it sounds like us today. Aren't we constantly saying, well, you'd think we'd learn the lesson, You'd think that this and that. Well, they didn't. And around 586 BC, then the southern kingdom was taken into Babylonian captivity. And so you have then all of those prophets, and you think about, I think I put it in the notes, Jonah. That book almost somewhat seems out of place. But what was that all about? What were the Ninevites? They Jews or Gentiles? Gentiles. It's a subtle reminder from God, I care about the Gentiles too. You know, sometimes we get this mentality that it was always all about the Hebrew people, and that's not the case. God always had the Gentiles in the eternal purpose of salvation, and that book of Jonah is a reminder of the fact that God wants the Gentiles to be saved just like He wanted the Hebrew people to be saved as well. All right, let's think for just a few minutes about that first period. And I said it covers Genesis chapter 1 to 11. And as you look at all the things that were created, the universe, biological life, marriage, and the home, work and responsibility, disobedience, sin, death, punishment, religion. What is religion? I hear that word thrown around a lot. And one of I remember back when Dennis Franchione was the football coach at Alabama for a short period of time. I remember an interview that I saw him do one time, and he was asked the question, "Are you religious?" He said, "No, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. Very spiritual, but I'm not religious." Well, let me ask you a question. Can you be spiritual and not be religious? Can you be religious and not be spiritual? Answer to the first question, can you be spiritual and not be religious? I don't see how you could. Can you be religious and not be spiritual? Yeah, I could see that being the case. But the word religion just literally, it's a compound word that means to bind back. All right, now, here's a division, and I think I mentioned this in the notes. Here's a division in the Bible that we don't talk about very much. We talk about the division between Old Testament and New Testament. We talk about the patriarchal, Mosaical, and Christian age. We talk about divisions between law and history and all those things. But how much do we talk about the division between Genesis 1 and 2 and Genesis 3:6? Genesis 1 and 2, God created a world where there was no sin. Now, that's hard for us to wrap our mind around. But in Genesis 1:2, there was no sin. And that didn't come until Genesis 3:6. Genesis chapter 1 is all about, and Levi said this earlier, God and perfection. 32 times in 31 verses, God is spoken of, God said, God created. All about God. It's really not about creation. It's about the God who did the creating. That's what it's really about. And verse 31 speaks of perfection. So Adam and Eve were created, and they were living in a world where there was no sin. There's only one place in which that's ever going to be again, and that's heaven. Now, there was a period of time, and think about this, even after the flood, all of that sin was gone, but it didn't take very long for it to come right back again. And part of the indication of that is, as good as Noah was not the answer to the problem of sin. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, Genesis 6 and 8, and aren't we great? Aren't we thankful? But he still wasn't the solution to sin, because no sooner had he come off of the ark than we see Genesis chapter 9 and the problem that arose there. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to have to stop right there. Sorry.